What are different ways that people could misuse or abuse stolen credit cards against our APIs, things like that. So these are things that don't have a really easy OWASP top 10 reference that we can talk about, but they're still important conversations.
Hi, you're listening to The Secure Developer. It's part of the DevSecOn community, a platform for developers, operators, and security people to share their views and practices on DevSecOps, Dev and Sec collaboration, cloud security, and more. Check out devsecon.com to join the community and find other great resources. This podcast is sponsored by Snyk. Snyk is a dev-first security company, helping companies fix vulnerabilities in their open source components and containers without slowing down development. To learn more, visit snyk.io. SNYK.io. On today's episode, Guy Podjarny, president and co-founder of Snyk, talks to Mike Shema. Mike works with developers at Squared to protect applications, their data, and their users. His experience in AppSec has ranged from manual security testing to building a commercial web scanner to help teams build secure products. He is one of the hosts of Application Security Weekly podcast and writes about InfoSec and DevSecOps, with an infusion of references to 80s music, apocalyptic sci-fi, and spooky horror to keep topics entertaining.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning back in to The Secure Developer. Today, we're going to look at application security and product security from two angles here. And to help us with that, we have Mike Shema, who on one hand co-hosts the Application Security Weekly podcast, and on the other hand, works on product security at Square. Mike, thanks a lot for joining us here on the podcast.
Thanks, Guy. And with that, my hands are full. So I've run out of other hands to talk with. Yes, exactly.
Indeed. Before we dive into those sort of two interesting angles you have on application security, can you tell us a little bit about what is it that you do and maybe a little bit about the journey that got you into security and where you are today?
Sure. So I'll kind of work backwards in time. I'll start with where I am now. Here at Square, work with, it's easy just to say product security, but what that really means is work with engineers and go through on a daily basis the fundamentals of threat modeling. What are you building? What could go wrong? And honestly, the important part, what are we going to do about it? And that's really interesting. So it's because that what could go wrong is a way to have a really fun, entertaining conversation with the engineers about what are they building. They have the context, they have the insights about that. So my role, I get to be more of as much a moderator or facilitator of engineers being creative thinkers about how to pick apart their own applications, as well as then doing consulting. So I'm doing a lot more consulting, collaborating than I am coding on a daily basis. But to get to this point, I was doing a lot of coding in C++, I will say, so that will always have a warm place in my heart, despite quite early difficulty and steep learning curve, let me say it that way, to get in to do it properly. But that was at Qualys, and there I was building a web application scanner. And that was a really fun way to get a really deep dive into what are web security problems and how much could we automate that. Because I'll say maybe, I'll phrase it this way, perhaps I'm a little bit lazy at heart, but it's more in the fact of, if I've done something 3 times, can I turn that into a bash script? And if I have a bash script that's working, maybe I could turn that into something that is, after a couple compiler errors, good working C++ code. And then before that, though, was really early days of application security before we had the OWASP top 10. This is back in late 90s, early 2000s, just doing manual testing, consulting, basically saying, here's a web application that's being built on not even ASP.NET with ASP and has some back-end database to it. And that was really exciting, quite honestly, because we were all figuring out what are the mistakes that developers are making. And I think one of the things I've come around to appreciate in this journey is that early on, I probably had more of the attitude of hacking web apps and thinking, wow, look at this horrible code. What are these idiot developers thinking? Then I got into Qualys doing some automation thinking, a lot of these attacks are so simple, cross-site scripting, SQL injection. What are those lazy pen testers doing? And then I've gotten to the point where I'm working now with teams, building products, and I've come, I think, a much healthier 180 and think, oh, right. There's a lot of engineering and difficulty to putting together products, building code, maintaining legacy code. And I have to admit, it's a much healthier approach, a much more constructive approach now to be like, Oh, I have empathy for developers who are working under engineering constraints and, by the way, need to write some secure code.
Yeah, that's a great learning and kind of well phrased. And I guess, you can think of it as kind of this seeing the light, so, like I'm learning to appreciate the two sides. But I guess if I over embrace the sort of dark and white analogy, you've also kind of moved from security vendors, from sort of building or kind of helping as part of a security tooling company, to securing inside a non-security organization and back again, I think a couple of times. What have you sort of seen as part of that type of empathy? Like, does it help? Does it also enrich your perspective?
It definitely helps. Definitely helps with empathy, because you suddenly see that, oh, this is how teams are using tools. These are how teams are bringing in vendors, and here are the vendors that succeed over time. Meaning they're not just solving an immediate problem, meaning they do solve a problem that developers actually have, but they're making that developer's life better. And I'm actually deliberately using that term developers right now, because I think that's one of the other things I've discovered, at least things that have changed in the past 5-10 years maybe, is that a lot of the security tools, a lot of the security vendors, if they can drop into an IDE, wow, that is 10 times, some other huge number times 100. That's an order of magnitude better for the developers, because go to where they are working, and the security team can still be the enablers. The security team can still help with vetting to say, oh, this is a good tool. This passes some baseline, findings that we would expect. It has a level of quality. But look, we're going to help you developers bring it together. So I think from that kind of vendor to consumer aspect, that's one of the things I've learned. And I think going back from the consumer to the vendor aspect, another thing I've learned is also figuring out just what solutions are smart to work on, rather than thinking from just a web application perspective. Oh, I want to go figure out how to automate this particular test, CSRF or cross-site scripting, or kill off this bug class. Those are neat, but if I just think I'm going to write the best cross-site scripting finding tool in the world, on the engineering side, why don't I just try to talk all of our front-end engineers to adopt React, and for the most part, not even have to worry about cross-site scripting at all? And then realize, oh, you know what the developers are doing? They're pulling in a lot of these open source tools, third-party dependencies. Suddenly they're pulling in gems, pip from Python, and so on. And some of these have problems. And I definitely will admit, at the point where I'm in my career, I don't want to have to be the one who sits down and manually audits, or even brings in some SaaS tool or something to vet all of that third-party code. That's a problem I'd love to push off onto some vendor, have a vendor solve for me. And it's one of those things I wouldn't initially have realized from the beginning, because my original thinking was, we just need to we need to secure the code that we're writing. And so if there's a theme of this particular episode, when light bulbs go off, the other light bulb that goes off is, oh, right, there's a lot of other code that we're using that has vulnerabilities. And I realize, I'm talking with you, I think you probably are kind of familiar with this problem space, but it's one of those ones that I'm honestly just saying a sincere discovery of my own, the problems that have come up that developers have run into, that we also don't want to try to say, developers, you're responsible for running all this code analysis and doing the inspection of all these third-party libraries.
Yeah, I mean, I think, clearly I kind of relate to the problem space and that need. Maybe you can also think about this a little bit as staying up to speed with the industry, because it could be that when you started in your sort of C++ roots, indeed most of the risks and most of the security concerns were far more in the code you write, but applications today don't look the way that they did before. Definitely with the advent of cloud native and the adoption of far larger quantities of open source, which is awesome, but also changes a little bit the security landscape. Maybe let's dig a little bit into Square and your work over there. So we oftentimes discuss on the podcast, what do security organizations look like? Can you describe a little bit, what does product security or cloud security, these related organizations, what do they look like at Square?
So Square is really cool. And so going back to that idea of empathy and working with engineers, Square security is actually really heavily engineering biased, meaning there are engineers writing alongside our cloud deployments, building up the platforms for our cloud usage. What does it mean for us to go cloud native and do that in a secure way, handling secrets, looking at Terraform, looking at configurations, avoiding the all too common, here's the open S3 bucket Elasticsearch instance that dumps everybody's data onto the internet. So it's heavy engineering from that, and it's also engineering that has that's focused on either a kind of components that we're using for fundamentals to build up applications. So it might be key management. It might be handling strong identity and authentication. It might be we're doing more now with privacy engineering, which is a very close ally of security. That's part of our security org that's engineering. So with that said, as well as I mentioned, the cloud, with that said, product security falls a bit closer on, let's call it sort of the governance side of things, which in the sense of just what is the risk out there? Is this acceptable risk? Is this risk that we should be worried about? And is this risk that should be addressed? And so that's sort of what product security team, our role is looking at to figure out what's going on in product areas and how can we either help to reinforce that, yes, you developers writing the code, you should have some ownership of security. What that means, though, is that here is what we might recommend on improving an authentication model, or making sure that let's have a conversation about abuse, because we can talk all we want about doing some code linting, doing analysis of third-party dependencies and whatnot, but it comes around to what if we lose money in account takeovers? What are different ways that people could misuse or abuse stolen credit cards against our APIs, things like that. So these are things that don't have a really easy OWASP top 10 reference that we can talk about, but they're still important conversations. So we have those conversations with the product team. And then some of the conversations we come back with the security org's engineering teams. And when we see that there's a common challenge within the product teams where we have a great story about secrets management for services within our data center. But if we're moving to the cloud, say AWS, GCP, for example, how much do we want to migrate our capabilities from the data center and just hook those up to the cloud? What about if we just want to use the cloud native types of secrets management? So there's conversations there just to figure out comfort levels, what are gaps between capabilities, and then also say, here's the API that a lot of our developers are used to. Can the security org engineering side of things go and recreate that API in the cloud, make it easy, just as easy to use this within Lambda and so on.
Interesting. So these cloud components are also a part of the product security domain. So product security collaborates with engineering, but it includes both decisions around implementation inside your own code or in your own application, as well as these cloud native cloud security decisions like, choice of containers or, the use of a cloud platform for secret management, for instance. Those all kind of qualify under that product security umbrella.
Indeed. And one of the ways, though, to explore it a bit more is that over time, especially personally, I've realized that there's no way I can become an expert on all of the security domains. And I think in general, we've seen many security careers, many security orgs also focus more on specializations. So our security engineering has a team that we call our infrastructure security that is focused on cloud infrastructure and securing cloud infrastructure. But we also have another that is just call it a more traditionally focused engineering team that is focused on building out the engineering capabilities of going into the cloud. So we already have a team that's outside of security, as well as the team inside of security, specializing in what does it mean to build apps and secure secrets, secure data, do encryption, do identity easily within the cloud. So someone in my role is a little bit more of a fixer, meaning like I know some basic principles to apply here in security, but once we get into the alphabet soup or the crazy long list of all the different services AWS has, let me make sure that I connect you to our security engineering team and the right people who have much better domain-specific knowledge about solving this. And the same may be true if we're talking about mobile or we're talking about something else. So that's really how we're aligning those kinds of specializations.
That's a really interesting structure there. So let me see if I got this right. So you have teams that are a bit more specialized, like security engineering or a cloud infrastructure security team, or maybe a mobile security team. So, and those teams have more focused security expertise, and they might, for instance, in the context of security engineering, build components to actually embody that expertise in components that are built into the application. And then product security's job is to be a liaison, or to be someone who has both a deeper understanding of the product than most of the security teams, and a deeper understanding of security than most of the product teams, and therefore know sometimes to answer questions right away, and sometimes to bring in the relevant expertise from another spot. Does that sound correct?
Yeah, that's it. And one of the things that we're trying to do, because in addition to just us being liaisons, we do want to honestly practice what we preach, in the sense of, what about security actually writing code and basically having that empathy for developers? Because I think not everyone needs to write code to be in a security org, but I think a security org does need teams that are writing code. So from the product security perspective, we've spun up call it a product security engineering team, just to be a little bit more specific about how we're calling them. And that is, the team is focused on, what can we do to help product teams solve maybe some of their domain specific problems, or something that's not necessarily that a one particular product area should own. Example of that might be just API abuse I was talking about earlier. One team might be getting abuse due to carding, stolen credit cards. Another might be suffering types of abuse against their API endpoints because people are attempting to do credential stuffing. Others might be making, other attackers may be attempting to go and enumerate data about merchants that we have, just that are leading to different types of account takeovers. So these types of things where we'll pull into product security engineering and start thinking, what can we do here to provide something that is a new capability that product teams can take advantage of to help with abuse? Or conversely, we might just flip it and say, what are some of the fundamental security principles or capabilities that any organization should have? One is, asset inventory. Everybody, it's easy to say, very, very hard to do, just like identity management, easy to say, very, very hard to do. So we have a security team dedicated to identity. We have a team, but we don't really have a team that's as well focused on inventory right now. Part of that is vulnerability management. So we do have a team dedicated to vulnerability management and scanning. But if we just say, hey, where are all of our APIs? Well, endpoints. One particular team could answer it, another team could answer it in their way, but we don't have across, if we I think an important question, ask that across the entire organization, what's our entire attack surface? That's something that we're starting to talk about within our product security engineering team to figure out, rather than have people like me and my peers go out and just interview and ask, hey, how many APIs? Okay, you've got 16, you have 12. Cool, on October 5th, this was the last number that we have. By the time October 6th rolls around, that data is outdated, it goes stale, etc. Let's solve this through some sort of automation. So that kind of gives an idea of also our mentality and how we're trying to organize our engineering to address those basic questions of things like inventory, attack surface.
Yeah, no, I think it sounds very adaptable and makes a lot of sense. I guess one last question still as I dig in, how does tooling work here? So, if you're looking to build, you kind of mentioned some scanning, or maybe there's, a protective piece of software that you want to put in. How does that play with that ownership split that you described?
So that's interesting. I think on the one hand, our security org still struggles, I think, like everybody else, build versus buy. I like to throw in the third one, build, buy, or why bother? Because there's some tooling that maybe we don't even need to worry about at all. It sounds neat, and maybe that's what everybody else is doing, but perhaps we've moved on for that. And, I'll kind of say, maybe I'll sort of tease and say, that's my cross-site scripting finder. Let's just move to React and not worry about a build or buy for that type of problem. On the other hand, though, what we're doing is we have tried to orient a lot of the security engineering teams, I think, around problem spaces. So call it cloud security, call it identity management, call it privacy, call it security infrastructure in terms of how we manage secrets or how we're protecting data, encrypting data. So with that said, then what we do is we start to look at tooling. What is the tooling the security team needs? So there's going to be easy things that just our incident response team. They need to have visibility into logs. They need to do analysis. So they'll work with teams on what the established engineering teams have done with their logging pipelines and tap into it. And so that's just tools that only the security team needs to really consume because that's their need. On the other hand, if we get into things like Terraform or tooling for cloud configurations, security is not the one that's actually generating the majority of those configurations and managing them through Terraform. But if security can look at those and say, here's a baseline we like, here's how we're going to analyze how different tools or how different teams are using their cloud ecosystem, and we can point out, ooh, looks like this is a mistake. Please look, here's another mistake. That is a great area for tooling. And that's where this infrastructure team is looking at what are the great easy steps they can do on their own for building their own tools. But is this asking the question too, is this a problem space that we want to become experts in? Or is there another vendor out there that actually addresses this type of problem? And I think coming from a company like Qualys, vulnerability scanning, that's kind of a commodity problem. That's where I would strongly recommend we should just buy. This is a well-established area. That's tools that have plenty of money behind them, engineers to solve that. But as we start to look into the cloud, AWS, we look GCP, for example, Azure even, what kind of security tools do these clouds offer? Are they sufficient? Can we just tweak them a bit, play around with the APIs they expose? Or maybe we need some better tooling from a third party because we want to make it happier for the engineers who are actually the ultimate consumers of these tools. So I realize that was a pretty long-winded answer to your question, but if I were to try to summarize, it's sort of like there's a couple tools we're building that we're the end users for, but when the user experience is important because it's the engineers consuming the tools, that's where we take a much closer look at that build versus buy scenario.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense, and it aligns to the team that eventually kind of has the most responsibility in it. So I guess I have one more question, maybe tee up a little bit of some of your insights from the podcast as well. So, you mentioned the way you're sort of split up within the org. What are some of the core practices that you think help make you successful at Square? And I don't know, like some of those, it's okay to say, they're successful here at Square, but maybe you even have a bit of a perspective on, are you doing it the same as is common in the industry? Do you think you've kind of struck a new nerve on it above and beyond the way you've already described the collaboration with teams?
I think some of the things, let's see, I'm trying to think, I'll think on my feet here. Some of the things that we're doing really well is starting from that perspective that the security org is actually writing code and building services. And I think that already is building it's building the trust that the security org understands the pain points that the engineers are going through. Meaning we're using the same tools they are building services. From sort of that product security team, some of the things that we are doing that are successful and we're trying to do more of is figuring out what threat modeling means and how we can be a bit more consistent about it in talking to as many engineers as possible. Because threat modeling, I will always love that, as well as keeping it simple, meaning what are you building, what could go wrong, starting just an open-ended conversation from there. But that's not something that's easily scalable. And, there's a lot of manual conversations that go through there. So I think we're doing a pretty good job there of having those conversations because the security team very much has the perspective of not being the team of saying no, not being the gatekeeper. So that's one of the things that I think the security org has done really well is for the most part, with a handful of exceptions that I think make sense as they relate to data handling policy, privacy, things like that. But they're pretty much product team, go forth and conquer. If you need help, we are here as the security team. And by the way, we're also doing monitoring. We're doing some design reviews. We may see some things and come up to you and say, let's discuss this design. There's some things that we can change. But I think that's helped give and build a lot of trust that make the conversations about threat modeling a lot easier because the engineers are not predisposed to be like, what's going to happen here, or this is going to interrupt my roadmap, things like that. So I think those are positive ways that the security org has approached it, both on engineering as well as just that communication and interaction with others.
Yeah, no, definitely. And threat modeling, it's I think the sort of the second time you're mentioning it here, clearly sort of a topic close to heart. So would you describe, talks about a very healthy relationship. Do you use a specific methodology around the threat modeling, above and beyond just sort of the trust and the positive interaction?
So not right now. And honestly, and we were still kind of in a discussion about how organized and how, say, standardized should the threat modeling be. And right now, I think the answer is really not very much, meaning, we don't need to get into something like Stride or a particular specific framework. And once we start to introduce tooling, some of the tooling becomes too much of a binary close-ended questions, meaning, are you doing this? Yes or no? Are you doing that? Yes or no? Are you doing this, the other thing? Yes or no? Are you exposed to the internet or not exposed to the internet? All these questions are fine, but if you step back for a second and say, why am I pushing a lot of this effort to answer 10 or 20 different questions on a developer about that may not actually have any bearing if I'm just trying to tease out one particular interesting thing? Why don't we go to the developer and just say, how would you attack your own product? What worries you the most? What's the area of code that keeps getting pushed off that nobody has had the time to go back and fix up, where you think all the to-dos are, your mental to-dos are in there. And I think those are the better ways of, call it, bringing in a framework around the threat modeling. I will say, however, that there should be a bit of a shared language. So if we start using terms like risk or vuln or flaw or exploit, just a little bit of shared language so we say this is what's happening, and we can say, here is an SSRF to use something more specific, or we just say this is an authentication problem, or this is an authorization problem, or a data handling, and just have those rough, broad categories. But I don't think we need to get into something overly specific.
Yeah, makes sense. It sounds like an easier way to actually achieve the discoverability, the information you need on the spot, even if you need to codify it a little bit more after.
Yeah.
So I feel like I can kind of continue asking you a whole bunch of questions about Square and the methodologies, but maybe let's sort of take a step up and look at the industry a bit more in breadth. So you're also the co-host of the Application Security Weekly podcast, and I'm sure you get this sort of great visibility, across the industry. What are some common practices that you say maybe recently have come to bear with regards to this type of developer collaborations, maybe things that weren't as popular before? You feel like they're gaining some momentum that you think are worth sharing here?
So I think if there's one thing, actually, speaking of momentum, I almost want to say that the DevOps, basically the engineering teams, they've pretty much leapfrogged security, I think, in the last couple of years, mostly because of the cloud. And I think that is because the engineers are seeing, here is how to abstract everything from my functions as a service, so Lambdas, all the way to infrastructure as a service. So everything pretty much gets abstracted into code. So the engineers are just doing great things about spinning up large or small applications within a single region, across a region, worldwide. And it boils down, for the most part, just some YAML or some human readable code. And the reason I say that they've leaped over security is that suddenly security is like, oh, wait, we can't just, you're developers and you're dealing with infrastructure. You're dealing with networking decisions. You're making these networking decisions because they work for your app. You need to. Same with data storage. And security can't just say, we're going to be the gatekeepers we need to review, because the pace of release is too quick. And as I was saying a little bit earlier, just the domain expertise. You can't have one person that just top to bottom knows everything, that the nuances of all of the cloud environment, let alone things like containers. And your listeners, and you might notice, I've kind of astutely avoided mentioning Kubernetes or containers, because that is absolutely a large blind spot for me in terms of being able to get and talk into like the ins and outs of security properties specifically. And it's, fortunately, I have colleagues and friends who could pick that side of the slack up for me. But so those are one of the trends we see. And that a lot of time, the reason I bring that up as a trend is that if we talk about, if I put my sales hat on or vendor hat on, they talk about personas, who's the buyer that they're interacting with. And a lot of times the buyers tend not to be as much the security team. they're the engineering team. They're coming down from your CTO, and they are saying, okay, we're building this code, building this infrastructure, and we want to do so securely, or we've been told by security we need to do, we want to, deploy secure code. How do we hook this up and make the engineers happy? Because the engineers are ultimately, and I think this is a good thing, responsible for a lot of the security. And so now the vendors are looking to that kind of CTO persona or that engineering persona to figure out, where are you working? Meaning, what can I do within your CLI, your command line, or within your IDE? And does my tool give you any value in there? And can you interact with it from the normal type of software development lifecycle that you're used to, rather than having to pull in the security team to approve something, or having to go out to yet another web application where you're looking at I'm trying to avoid this single pane of glass, but that's what that's the euphemism, right?
As you get to, no.
Yeah, exactly. Developers have enough tabs open in their browsers as it is. They don't need yet another one. So those are some of the trends, meaning engineering has really pushed the need for security. And actually, they've taken and done a lot of security capabilities roles in all of these abstractions of code and infrastructure as a service. They're pulling in tools into their own tools, call it the CI/CD pipeline. And security, I think, is where it needs to catch up. And I like working at Square because I think security has caught up quite a bit with the heavy investment as engineering teams on the security org. But other security orgs should be considering, what does it mean to work with developers as well as build services for developers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is heavily a sort of recurring need that indeed comes up. I have this perspective around this shift of IT, as you described, to as a service, where really there's a whole set of needs that need to move from IT security solutions to application security solutions. It's the same concerns. It's around an unpatched server. It's around a network decision. It's around a misconfiguration. We're probably doing more of them than before, but they no longer require IT security solutions. They require an application security solution, basically bringing them into this world of product security, of application security. And I'm curious also, to an extent, because of how you described this sort of partnering in Square between product security and development, do you hear more about security champions program or practices like that connect the two entities? Do you see a rise in that type of partnership? Do you find it is needed in Square, on top of the partnership you already have?
So it's one of those things that I'd love to see develop and have more of at Square. So primarily in the sense of having a venue for communication and collaboration for security-minded engineers who want to be tuned in to, one, what's the security org doing, as well as just having those conversations about what's going on within. Here is a breach in the news. How does that affect us? And sort of having call it a pre-mortem. Let's have a tabletop exercise and say, what if this breach happened to us and we did have a S3 bucket opened? Or what if all of our engineers, their OAuth tokens were compromised into some other SaaS we're using? Those would be really fun to see. So we don't have that yet here, but I'd love to see that. And prior to Square, I also worked on product security at Yahoo. And Yahoo was a company that did actually have a pretty good, I went through a couple of versions of it, but called a Security Champions program. And Yahoo's pretty cool. They branded their security team the Paranoids. So they had what was called the local Paranoids. But that was successful. And I thought that, especially for a large company, because you can't really scale like my role. I can't go out and scale and just have, I could if I wanted to, every single day, every single hour, yet another threat modeling conversation with this other particular service, this other particular product. But ultimately, that's not really the smartest way. And you can burn people out that way. So when you are approaching a problem with manual processes, something like threat modeling or just discussion and call it security awareness, you do need people, but those people should be coming from the engineering org. And that's absolutely where a Security Champions program comes from. One of the challenges is that it's great for self-selecting because people who are interested in security will be like, yeah, I'd love to talk about that. What's going on? Hey, I heard about this really cool presentation out of this year's Black Hat, this year's DEF CON, et cetera, and they want to talk about that. One of the challenges, though, is how do you then get into other orgs and other engineers and bring them, incentivize them when they perhaps have desire, but they don't necessarily have enough time? Or they may just ask quite bluntly, what's in it for me? I'm being measured on how much code I write. And that's not exactly the case. I'm being a little bit facetious, but if they're worried how much code I write, how many sprints I'm successfully delivering on time, having time to talk about security doesn't play so easily into that. So that's one of the things that's always a hard problem to solve.
Yeah, I definitely have been hearing more and more about security champions on this podcast and from other security leaders that I talk to here. And hopefully, if you're sort of following this podcast, you would have heard a bunch of those in our sort of collection episode here. But hopefully, there's increasing patterns that shape up around allocating some times. We had Jeff from Medallia talk about how they actually give a Stanford credential to developers that participate in that. All sorts of at Twilio, they have a progression process for kind of certifying you. And in one of them, I think it was again Medallia, they have a rotation element to it. There's some interesting practices shaping up in the industry. Hopefully we can all learn from one another. A pile more questions for you, Mike, but I think we're really kind of starting to sort of stretch the amount of time here. So before I let you go, if I can get one more sort of bit of advice, if you have one advice or one, it could be a pet peeve you want people to stop doing, or just one top tip that you want to give a team looking to level up their security foo, what would that be?
So I'll turn the pet peeve into something more positive, as well as to be alliteration there. But that would be the arguments, discussions, conversations around which programming language should we use. And honestly, I was saying earlier on, I love my C++. There's plenty of, call it memory safety issues. I've written my share of them, as Valgrind has pointed out to me. So let's really worry anymore about making fun of a particular language, except for Perl, sorry. And more focus on, can it be readable? And that was actually why I'm kind of joking about Perl, is that just what code are you writing in? Is it readable? Is it maintainable? And so I would say do less of worrying about the choice of language and more of, is the language leading to a point where you have simple linting, that you can have git commit hooks that point out common errors, common mistakes. And honestly, as someone who enjoys writing as well as who enjoys reading, is the code nice to look at? Can you hand it to someone else and it doesn't have a 10-page README on it with a bunch of paragraphs, and can they, for the most part, look at it, understand what's going on? Because especially Square is no stranger to this. Reorgs happen, ownership changes within code, people come and go. The legacy code builds and builds. I mentioned working at Yahoo, and companies that's been around for 20 years, you're going to have legacy code. But if you have code that is mostly scrutable, meaning someone can read it, and you can lint on it pretty easily to find simple mistakes. I think that's really what I would say. Go in on that, and hopefully a lot then of other, as your security champions become more aware, become smarter or more knowledgeable about security topics, you can improve the design, improve the architecture, but to start with simple linting.
Yeah, no, perfect. That's good. Kind of at the core, at the basics, and very, very important to build on. Mike, this has been a pleasure. Thanks a lot for coming onto the show.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed chatting with you. This was fun.
And thanks everybody for tuning in. And I hope you join us for the next one.
Thanks for listening to The Secure Developer. That's all we have time for today. To find additional episodes